The Ordeal of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. The Problem of Peace. Jefferson Davis was temporarily clapped into arms during the early days of his 2-year imprisonment. He and fellow conspirators were finally released. All rebel leaders were pardoned by President Andrew Johnson in 1868. Congress removed all remaining civil disabilities some 30 years later. Congress posthumously restored Davis's citizenship more than a century later. Conditions in the South. The Old South collapsed economically and socially. Handsome cities like Charleston and Richmond were now rubble-strewn and weed-choked. Economic life creaked to a halt. Banks and businesses locked doors, ruined by runaway inflation. Factories were smokeless, silent, and dismantled. Transportation was broken down completely. Agriculture, the economic lifeblood of the South, was almost completely crippled. The slave labor system collapsed. Not until 1870 would the cotton production be at pre-war levels. The princely planter aristocrats were humbled by these losses. The investment of more than $2 billion in slaves evaporated with emancipation. Beaten but unbent, many white Southerners remained dangerously defiant. They continued to believe their view of secession was correct and the so-called lost cause was a just war. Such attitudes boded ill for the prospects of painlessly binding up the Republic's wounds. Charleston, South Carolina in ruins, April 1865. Rebel troops evacuating Charleston blew up military supplies to deny them to General William Tecumseh Sherman's forces. The explosions ignited fires that all but destroyed the city. There was a confusion over what the precise meaning of freedom for blacks meant. There was a variety of responses to emancipation. Many masters resisted freeing their slaves. Some slaves' pent-up bitterness burst forth violently. Eventually, all masters were forced to recognize their slaves' permanent freedom. Some blacks initially responded with suspicion. Many took new names and demanded that their former masters address them as Mr. or Mrs. Whites were forced to recognize the realities of emancipation. Thousands took the roads, some to test their freedom, others searched for long-lost spouses, parents, and children. Emancipation strengthened the black family. Many nude freed men and women formalized slave marriages for personal and pragmatic reasons, including the desire to make their children legal heirs. Others left to work in towns where existing black communities provided protection and mutual assistance. Whole communities moved in search of opportunities. 25,000 exodusters went to Kansas. Church became the focus of black communities. They formed their own churches, pastored by their own ministers. Black churches grew robustly. They formed the bedrock of black community life and gave rise to other benevolent, fraternal, and mutual aid societies. All of these organizations helped blacks protect their newly won freedom. Emancipation meant education for many blacks. Freedmen raised funds to purchase land, build schoolhouses, and hire teachers, all proof of their independence. Southern blacks soon found the demand outstripped the supply of qualified black teachers. They accepted the aid of northern white women sent by the American Missionary Association to volunteer as teachers. They also turned to the federal government for help. Freed blacks were going to need all the friends and power they could muster in Washington. Educating young freedmen and freed women, 1870s. Freed slaves in the South regarded schooling as the key to improving their children's lives and fulfillment of a long-sought right that had been denied blacks in slavery. These well-dressed schoolchildren are lined up outside their rural one-room schoolhouse alongside their teachers, both black and white. The Freedmen's Bureau was created March 3, 1865. It was a primitive welfare agency that provided food, clothing, medical care, and education, both to freedmen and white refugees. It was headed by Union General Oliver Howard, who later founded Howard University in Washington, D.C. The Bureau achieved its greatest successes in education. It taught 200,000 blacks to read. In other areas, the Bureau's achievements were meager. It was supposed to settle former slaves on 40-acre tracts confiscated from Confederates, but little land made it to the former slaves. Administrators collaborated with planters in expelling blacks from towns and cajoling them into signing labor contracts to work for their former masters. White Southerners resented the Bureau as a federal interloper that threatened to upset white racial dominance. President Johnson repeatedly tried to kill the Bureau. What manner of man was Andrew Johnson? He reached the White House from very humble beginnings. Born to impoverished parents, he was orphaned early. He never attended school, but apprenticed to a tailor at the age of 10. He taught himself to read. Later, his wife taught him to write and do simple arithmetic. Johnson became active in Tennessee politics. He was an impassioned champion of poor whites against the planter aristocrats. He excelled as a stump speaker. He was elected to Congress, where he attracted favorable attention in the North, but not the South, when he refused to secede with Tennessee. After Tennessee was partially redeemed by Union troops, he was appointed war governor and served courageously in a dangerous job. Politics next thrust Johnson into the vice presidency. Lincoln's Union Party in 1864 needed a person who would attract war Democrats. Old Andy was a man of unpolished parts. He was intelligent, able, forceful, and honest. He was steadfastly devoted to duty and to the people. He was a dogmatic champion of states' rights and the Constitution. Yet he was also a misfit, a Southerner who did not understand the North, a Tennessean distrusted by the South, a Democrat never accepted by the Republicans. He was hot-headed and contentious and stubborn, and he was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A Reconstruction policy devised by angels might well have failed in his tactless hands. Crushed by the Constitution, President Andrew Johnson revered the U.S. Constitution, but eventually felt its awesome weight in his impeachment trial. War over Reconstruction. Lincoln believed the Southern states had never legally withdrew from the Union. His 10% Reconstruction Plan in 1863 proposed that a state could be reintegrated into the Union when 10% of its voters in the presidential election of 1860 swore allegiance to the United States and pledged to abide by emancipation. The next step would be the formal erection of state government. Lincoln would then recognize the new purified regime. Lincoln's plan provoked a sharp reaction in Congress, where Republicans feared the restoration of the planter aristocracy and the possible re-enslavement of blacks. The Republicans rammed the Wade-Davis bill through Congress in 1864. It required 50% of the state's voters to take an oath of allegiance, and demanded stronger safeguards for emancipation than Lincoln's as the price of readmission to the Union. Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill. Controversy over the Wade-Davis bill revealed the deep differences between the president and Congress. Congress insisted seceders who left the Union committed suicide as Republican states. Thus, they forfeited their rights and could be readmitted only as conquered provinces, on such conditions as Congress should decree. The majority of the moderate group agreed with Lincoln that seceded states should be restored as simply and swiftly as possible, though on Congress's terms, not the President's. The minority radical group believed that the South should atone more for its sins. They wanted its social structure uprooted, planters punished, and newly emancipated blacks protected by federal powers. Andrew Johnson agreed with Lincoln that seceded states never left the Union. He quickly recognized several of Lincoln's 10% governments. On May 29, 1865, Johnson issued his Reconstruction Proclamation. He disfranchised certain leading Confederates, including those with taxable property worth more than $20,000, though they might petition him for personal pardons. He called for special state conventions to repeal ordinances of secession, to repudiate all Confederate debts, and to ratify the slave-freeing 13th Amendment. States that complied would be swiftly readmitted to the Union. Johnson granted pardons in abundance. He was bolstered by the political resurrection of the planter elite. The recently rebellious states moved rapidly to organized governments in 1865. As the pattern of new governments became clear, Republicans of all stripes grew furious. Black codes regulated the activities of emancipated blacks. Mississippi was the first to pass such laws in November of 1865. These laws varied in severity from state to state. Mississippi's was the harshest, Georgia's the most lenient. Their aims were to ensure a stable and subservient labor force. Whites wanted to retain the tight control they exercised in the days of slavery. There were dire penalties on blacks who jumped labor contracts and committed them to work for the same employer for 1 year, generally at pittance wages. Violators could be made to forfeit black wages or be dragged back to work by a Negro catcher. In Mississippi, captured freedmen could be fined. Then they were hired out to pay the fines. This arrangement closely resembled slavery. It tried to restore the pre-emancipation system of race relations. All codes forbade a black to serve on a jury. Some even barred blacks from renting or leasing land. Blacks could be punished for idleness by working on a chain gang. Nowhere were blacks allowed to vote. These oppressive laws mocked the ideal of freedom. They imposed burdens on former slaves struggling against mistreatment and poverty. The worst features of black codes were eventually repealed, but the revocation did not lift liberated blacks into economic independence. Lacking capital, many former slaves slipped into the status of sharecropper, as did many landless whites. Sharecroppers fell into a morass of virtual peonage. Many blacks and poor whites became slaves to the soil and to their creditors. The dethroned planter aristocracy resented even this pitiful concession to freedom. Black codes made an ugly impression on the North. Sharecroppers picking cotton. Although many freed slaves found themselves picking cotton on their former masters' plantations, they took comfort that they were at least paid wages and could work as a family unit. In time, however, they became ensnared in the web of debt that their planter bosses spun to keep a free labor force tightly bound to them. Congress met in December 1865. The new Southern delegations presented themselves to the Capitol. Many were former Confederate leaders, 4 former Confederate generals, 5 colonels, and various members of the Richmond cabinet and Congress. Worst of all, Alexander Stephens, the ex-vice president, was still under indictment for treason. The presence of these whitewashed rebels infuriated Republicans in Congress. Also, during the war, Republicans were able to pass legislation favorable to the North. The Morrill Tariff, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the Homestead Act. On the first day of the congressional session, December 4, 1865, they shut the door on the newly elected Southerners. They realized that the restored South would be stronger than ever in national politics. With the full counting of blacks because of the end of the 3/5 clause for representation, rebel states were entitled to 12 more votes in Congress and 12 more electoral votes in the presidential elections. Republicans had good reason to fear. Southerners might join with Northern Democrats and gain control of Congress and maybe even the White House. They could then perpetuate the Black Codes and dismantle the economic programs of the Republican Party by lowering tariffs, rerouting the Transcontinental Railroad, repealing the Free Farm Homestead Act, and even repudiating the national debt. Johnson had deeply disturbed congressional Republicans when he announced on December 6, 1865, that the rebellious states had satisfied his conditions, in his view, and the Union had been restored. The clash exploded in February of 1866. The president vetoed a bill extending the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was later repassed. Republicans passed the Civil Rights Bill, which conferred on blacks the privilege of American citizenship and struck at black codes. It was vetoed by Johnson. In April, congressmen steamrollered over his veto, something repeatedly done. Lawmakers riveted the principles of the Civil Rights Bill into the 14th Amendment, which was approved by Congress and sent to states in 1866 and ratified in 1868. It was a sweeping amendment and a major pillar of constitutional law. It conferred civil rights, including citizenship, but excluding franchise on freedmen. It reduced proportionately representation of a state in Congress and the Electoral College if it denied blacks the ballot. It also disqualified from federal and state office former Confederates who, as federal office holders, had once sworn to support the Constitution of the United States. It guaranteed the federal debt while repudiating the Confederate debt. The radical faction was disappointed that the 14th Amendment did not grant the right to vote. All Republicans agreed no state should be readmitted into the Union without first ratifying the 14th Amendment. Johnson advised the southern states to reject it. All did, but Tennessee. An Inflexible President, 1866. This Republican cartoon shows Johnson knocking blacks out of the Freedmen's Bureau by his veto. The battle between Johnson and Congress. The 10% governments passed the Black Codes. In response, Congress extended the Freedmen's Bureau and passed the Civil Rights Bill. Johnson vetoed both measures. Would the South accept the principles enshrined in the 14th Amendment? Republicans would settle for nothing less. The crucial congressional elections of 1866. Johnson's famous swing round the circle in 1866 was a comedy of errors. He delivered a series of give 'em hell speeches. As a vote-getter, he was highly successful for the opposition. His inept speech-making heightened the cry, "Stand by Congress," against the Tailor of the Potomac. When the votes were counted, Republicans had more than 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. Republicans had a veto-proof Congress and unlimited control of the Reconstruction policy. Radicals in the Senate, led by the courtly and principled idealist Charles Sumner, labored tirelessly for black freedom and racial equality. In the House, the most powerful was Thaddeus Stevens, who had defended runaway slaves in court without fees. He insisted on being buried in a black cemetery. Devoted to blacks, he hated rebellious white Southerners and was a leading figure on the Joint Committee on Reconstruction. Radicals opposed the rapid restoration of Southern states and wanted to keep them out as long as possible. They wished to apply federal power to bring about the drastic social and economic transformation in the South. Moderate Republicans invoked the principle of states' rights and self-government. They recoiled from the full implications of the radical program and preferred policies that restrained states from abridging citizens' rights rather than policies that directly involved the federal government in individual lives. The policies adopted by Congress showed the influence of both groups. By 1867, both agreed on the necessity to enfranchise black votes, even if it took federal troops to do so. By 1866, there were bloody race riots in several Southern cities. Republicans campaigning in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1868. The soldiers' caps and regimental flags demonstrate the continuing federal military presence in the Reconstruction South. Radical Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens said that Reconstruction must revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain. The Reconstruction Act was passed by Congress on March 2, 1867. It divided the South into 5 military districts, each commanded by a Union general and policed by about 20,000 blue-clad soldiers. It temporarily disfranchised tens of thousands of former Confederates. Congress laid stringent conditions for readmission, and it required states to ratify the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment gave former slaves rights as citizens. The bitterest pill was the stipulation that they guarantee in state constitutions full suffrage to former adult male slaves. It stopped short of giving freedmen land or education at federal expense. The overriding purpose of moderates was to create an electorate in the South that would vote their states back into the Union on acceptable terms, thus freeing the government from direct responsibility for the protection of black rights. This approach proved woefully inadequate to the cause of justice for blacks. For radical Republicans, the only true safeguard was to incorporate black suffrage into the federal Constitution. Congress sought to provide constitutional protection for the suffrage provisions of the Reconstruction Act. The 15th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1869, was ratified by the required number of states in 1870. The military reconstruction of the South usurped some presidential function as commander-in-chief and set up a martial regime of dubious legality. Ex parte Milligan in 1866 ruled that military tribunals could not try civilians even during wartime in areas where civil courts were open. Peacetime military rule seemed contrary to the spirit of the Constitution, but circumstances were extraordinary. Southern states started the task of constitution making. By 1877, all of them had reorganized governments and were accorded full rights. When federal troops left a state, its government swiftly passed back into the hands of white redeemers or home rule regimes, inevitably democratic. In 1877, the last federal muskets were removed from state politics, and a solid democratic South congealed. The struggle for black freedom and the crusade for women's rights were one and the same to many women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony during the war temporarily shelved their own demands. They worked wholeheartedly for the cause of black emancipation. The Women's Loyal League gathered 400,000 signatures on petitions asking Congress to pass a constitutional amendment prohibiting slavery. With the war over and the 13th Amendment passed, feminist leaders believed their time had come. They reeled with shock when the wording of the 14th Amendment, which defined equal citizenship, inserted the word male into the Constitution in referring to a citizen's right to vote. Both Stanton and Anthony campaigned against the 14th Amendment, despite pleas from Frederick Douglass, who supported women's suffrage but believed this was the Negro's hour. Congress haltingly and belatedly secured the franchise for freedmen. Lincoln and Johnson had proposed to give the ballot gradually to blacks who qualified for it through education, property ownership, or military service. Moderates and many radicals at first hesitated to bestow suffrage on freedmen. The 14th Amendment was the heart of the Republican program for Reconstruction, but it fell short of guaranteeing the right to vote. They envisioned for blacks and women citizenship without voting rights. Northern states withheld the ballot from their tiny black minorities. Southerners argued Republicans were hypocritical in insisting blacks in the South be allowed to vote. The Union League. Black men seized the initiative to organize politically. Freedmen turned the League into a network of political clubs. Their mission included building black churches and schools, representing black grievances before local employers and government, and recruiting militias to protect black communities from white retaliation. African American women's roles. Women did not obtain the right to vote. They attended parades and rallies common in black communities and helped assemble mass meetings in the new black churches. They showed up at constitutional conventions, monitoring proceedings, and participating in informal votes outside the convention halls. African American men's roles. Some were elected as delegates to the state constitutional convention and formed the backbone of black political communities. At the conventions, they sat down with whites to hammer out new state constitutions that provided for a universal male suffrage. Even though there were no governors or majorities in the state senates, black power increased exponentially. Former masters lashed out at freedmen's white allies with the terms scalawags and carpetbaggers. Scalawags were Southerners, former Unionists, and Whigs. Carpetbaggers were supposedly sleazy Northerners who packed all their goods into a carpetbag suitcase at the war's end and had come to seek personal power and profit. Most were Northern businessmen and former Union soldiers who wanted to play a role in modernizing the New South. Radical legislatures passed much desirable legislation and made steps toward establishing adequate public schools. They streamlined tax systems, launched public works, and granted property rights to women. Many reforms were retained by the all-white Redeemer government that later returned to power in the South. Despite achievements, corruption was rampant, especially in South Carolina and Louisiana. Conscienceless pocket patters used inexperienced blacks as pawns. the worst black and white legislatures purchased as legislative supplies such stationery as hams, perfumes, suspenders, bonnets, corsets, and champagne. Corruption by no means was confined to the South in the post-war years. Deeply embittered, some Southern whites resorted to savage measures against radical rule. They resented successful black legislators. Secret organizations mushroomed. The most notorious was the Invisible Empire of the South, the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Tennessee in 1866. They used fright, tomfoolery, and terror against the upstart blacks. The so-called upstarts were flogged, mutilated, and murdered. The Klan became the refuge for bandits and cutthroats. Any scoundrel could don a sheet. The Force Acts of 1870-71 were used by U.S. troops to stamp out the lash law. White resistance undermined the attempts to empower blacks politically. The white South flouted the 14th and 15th Amendments. There were wholesale disfranchisement of blacks in the 1890s. The use of intimidation, fraud, and trickery was widespread. Literacy tests were unfairly administered by whites to advantage illiterate whites. Whites used the goal of white supremacy to justify such devices. Congressman John R. Lynch of Mississippi. After John Lynch was freed by the Union Army, he got an education at a freedmen's school in Natchez, Mississippi. At age 24, he became Speaker of the Mississippi House. In 1872, Lynch joined 6 other African Americans in Congress, where he made his greatest mark in the long debate over the Civil Rights Act of 1875, barring discrimination in public accommodation. Lynch drew on his own humiliating experiences as a black man in the South to argue for a law prohibiting discrimination on public transportation like trains and at places like inns, restaurants, and theaters. The law passed but was not enforced. It was ruled unconstitutional in 1883. Klansmen in costume. Members of the Ku Klux Klan, like these 2 garbed men, utilized terrorist violence on behalf of a political agenda. The disenfranchisement of African Americans and their Republican allies, and the reinstatement of white supremacist rule by Redeemer governments. Impeachment drama. The impeachment proceedings against President Andrew Johnson, among the most severe constitutional crises in the Republic's history, were high political theater, and tickets were in sharp demand. Radicals attempted to remove Johnson from office. Their initial step used the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which was passed over Johnson's veto. It required that the president get consent of the Senate before he could oust an appointee once they had been approved. One goal was to freeze into the cabinet Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a holdover from Lincoln's administration, who secretly served as informer for the radicals. Johnson abruptly dismissed Stanton early in 1868. The House voted 126 to 47 to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors, as required by the Constitution. They charged him with violations of the Tenure of Office Act and 2 additional articles related to Johnson's verbal assaults on Congress that involved disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach. Johnson's trial before the Senate. The House conducted a prosecution. Johnson kept his dignity and maintained a discreet silence. His attorneys argued that the president was testing the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act by firing Stanton. House prosecutors had a hard time building a compelling case for impeachment. On May 16, 1868, by a margin of 1 vote, radicals failed to muster the 2/3 majority to remove Johnson. 7 moderate Republican senators voted not guilty. Several factors shaped the outcome. Fears of creating a destabilizing precedent, principled opposition to abusing the constitutional mechanism of checks and balances, and political considerations. A successor would have been the radical Republican Benjamin Wade, President pro tem of the Senate. Wade was disliked by the business community for his high tariff, soft money, pro-labor views. Distrusted by moderate Republicans, die-hard radicals were infuriated by the failure to remove Johnson. The nation avoided a dangerous precedent that would have gravely weakened one of the 3 branches of the federal government. Johnson's administration, though enfeebled at home, achieved its most enduring success in foreign relations. The Russians wanted to sell Alaska. In case of war with Britain, Russia would have lost it to the sea-dominant British. Alaska had been ruthlessly furred out and was a growing economic liability. The Russians were eager to unload their frozen asset. They preferred the purchase by the United States of America because they wanted to strengthen the United States as a barrier against Britain. In 1867, the Secretary of State William Seward, an ardent expansionist, signed the treaty with Russia and transferred Alaska to the United States for the bargain price of $7.2 million. Seward's enthusiasm was not shared by his uninformed countrymen, who called it Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox, Frigidia and Walrusian. Why did the United States purchase Alaska? Russia alone among the major powers had been friendly to the North during the Civil War, and America did not want to offend their friend, the Tsar. The territory also had furs, fish, gold, and other natural resources, so Congress accepted Seward's polar bear garden. Alaska and the lower 48 states, a size comparison. White Southerners regarded Reconstruction as a more grievous wound than the war itself. It left scars that took generations to heal. They resented the upending of their social and racial system. They resented the political empowerment of blacks and the insult of federal intervention in their affairs. It was a wonder, given all the bitterness from war, that Reconstruction was not far harsher than it was. No one knew at the war's end what the federal policy toward the South should be. Republicans acted from a mixture of idealism and political expediency. They wanted to protect the freed slaves and promote the fortunes of the Republican Party. In the end, their efforts backfired badly. Reconstruction conferred only fleeting benefits on blacks. It destroyed the Republican Party in the South for nearly 100 years. Moderate Republicans never fully appreciated the extensive effort needed to make freed slaves completely independent citizens, or the lengths to which Southern whites would go to preserve the system of racial dominance. Despite good intentions by Republicans, the Old South was more resurrected than reconstructed, and spelled continuing woe for generations of Southern blacks. Is This a Republican Form of Government? By Thomas Nast, Harper's Weekly, 1876. The nation's most prominent political cartoonist expressed his despair at the tragic way that Reconstruction had ended, with few real gains for the former slaves.